When we talk about organizations and organizational communication, we're talking about lots of different things. But if we could boil it down to a few key ideas, what would those ideas be? The first is that when we talk about organizations, we're talking about lots of different types of organizations. We're talking about businesses. We're talking about companies that exist to sell a product or a service. But we're also talking about nonprofits, organizations that exist to serve some function in a community, either to provide a good or a service that they don't charge their customers or their community for. But we're also talking about things like churches. Churches are organizations. We're also talking about things like community organizations, like a parent-teacher organization or a volunteer organization as a part of a local government. So organizations can look like lots of different things, but they tend to have very similar components, elements. And the three that we are going to look at have to do with the organizing. How does this organization form? What are the rules that govern how this organization has come about and how this organization will accomplish its goals? Because all organizations have at their root a goal. It's either to serve a community, to make money for their shareholders, to legislate or represent their community, to create change, to provide a service. All organizations are serving what's called a superordinate goal. In other words, it drives all of their decisions. Sometimes we call this goal the organization's mission. So, how do organizations form? That's one question that we're going to try and answer. Another question that we're going to try and answer is, what is the value of an organization's culture? First of all, how do we know what an organization's culture is? How does it differ from the dominant culture of a society? Is it different or is it the same? Who gets a hand in creating that culture? Does it get created or does it emerge? But what's the impact of that culture on the organization, on their customers, their shareholders, their community? There's lots wrapped up in culture. So we're going to try and answer the question of what's the value of the organization's culture and how does it impact the organization? The last question that we're going to try and answer is, what does leadership in an organization typically look like? Where does it come from? How is it sustained? Where does it derive its authority from? What does power look like in an organization? What does it mean to not have power in an organization? It doesn't matter if we're looking at a church, Walmart, a local town government, or a nonprofit. All of these organizations are going to have these three components: organization, culture, and power or leadership. And power and leadership aren't always the same thing, which is going to make things a little complicated. But all of these things are shaping what we're looking at when we look at organizational communication. Those are the three general topic areas that we look at when we're looking at organizational communication. Things like relationships at work, that might fall into all three. Things like bureaucracy, that may impact all three, but we can look at it through one of these lenses and then start building on our understanding of those things. Really, I think there's a big question that we're looking at when we look at organizational communication that is inherent in all of these, but I want to make sure it's said, and that is, what is the role of communication in organizations? What purpose, role, goal does it have to communicate in an organization? What does it look like? What function does it serve? What are the constraints? The discipline of communication has what you might think of as different camps, different groups that have a very specific way of looking at a question like this. So what I want us to do is take a look at those 7 different camps. Understand though that you can fit into multiple camps. You don't have to just be in one. We tend to see that one may sort of be a primary lens for viewing questions about communication. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to answer this question of what is the role of communication in organizations through each of those different lenses. And what I want you to do is think about which of these resonates with the way I view the world and communication the most. So here are these 7 different ways that we could try to answer that question. We're going to go through each of these. The first way that we could try to answer this question is rhetorically. What is the role of communication in an organization? Well, we would look at communication as strategic. In other words, when people communicate, they're doing so with a desire to achieve a goal, and that the way that they're communicating is therefore strategic. Who they're communicating with, the message, the medium, the channel that they're using, all of these are strategic choices. We're looking at lowercase d discourse. In other words, rather than looking at capital D, which would be, the cultural conversation about something, we're looking at what is the more lower level conversation. What's the one-on-one or the small group conversation look like? We might look at a boss speaking to a group of people, giving a quarterly update, or maybe there's been some major crisis and they're speaking to the whole company. That's the kind of communication that we might look at from a rhetorical standpoint if we're looking at organizational communication. But we also would look at communication as being persuasive. If there is a goal in the communication event, then it is the purpose of the speaker to try and achieve that goal. And that almost always comes through some act of persuasion. So someone who's coming from a rhetorical standpoint or a rhetorical lens or the rhetorical camp would say the role of communication in an organization is strategic, it's persuasive, and it's happening at a localized level. Okay? The second lens or camp that we might look at is the semiotic lens. Someone who's coming from this camp or this lens would answer the question of what is the role of communication in an organization by looking at its symbolic nature. Language is symbolic, right? That my understanding of language is shaping the symbols that I'm using to try and communicate an idea that I have. So a semiotic lens would say, what are the symbols that we are using to communicate something about our organization? So we might look at logos, icons, brands, to understand what does someone who sees, one of these logos, what comes to their mind when they see that logo. A semiotic lens sees language as a shared understanding, that one person's perception of an organization is not sufficient. We're instead looking at what are the shared meanings behind certain ideas or symbols, and how could we use that in such a way to communicate something about our organization. A semiotic lens also sees communication as polysemous. Polysemous means that there are many meanings to a given symbol. So, for example, one group of people might see the symbol of Ford and have a very positive connection to that idea of the Ford brand. But there are an entirely different group of people who see the Ford brand and see it as something maybe negative or less reliable or something along those lines. You think of it like a baseball team, if you're a baseball fan. Seeing your team's logo might fill you with pride, right? But when you see your rival's team logo or jersey, you want to spit, or you want to, curse that team or whatever that is. That logo is polysemous. It means different things to different people. It has multiple meanings. So the semiotic lens would answer that question of what is the role of communication in an organization? Well, it's symbolic. It's a shared understanding of what was that message, but it's also polysemous, that there are multiple meanings to the symbols that we use, and depending on who we're talking to, they might have a different understanding of what we're talking about. The third type of lens that we could use would be the phenomenological lens. Someone from this camp would answer the question of what is the role of communication in an organization by saying communication is experiential. We're going to look at the communication that you have communicated, that you have expressed, or that you have received. And how did you interact with? How did you make meaning out of? How did you interpret that message? It is a very individual way of understanding communication. I might go and talk to a specific person and get their specific ideas about a message or a brand in a phenomenological perspective. It's very personal, but it's also associative. How am I making connections about what I heard today to what I heard yesterday, to what I remember when I was hired and trained? Someone from this perspective is going to look at communication as a perspective of the individual. How does that individual's perspective shape the communication within the organization? The fourth type of lens or camp that we might look at comes from a cybernetic perspective. Now, there is a whole field of cybernetics, so we're not talking about that field. We are instead looking at a very unique perspective on the discipline of communication that comes from this idea of a cybernetic perspective. A cybernetic perspective is looking at systems, networks, and processes. So when they try to answer the question of what is the role of communication in an organization, someone from this perspective is going to look at what software do these people use to communicate? Do they text? Do they use GroupMe? Do they Slack? And how do those mediums integrate with other functions within the organization? Who talks to who? What's the structure of the organization? Is there good cross-pollination between groups, or is it very linear in their communication? Not only who talks to who, but what do they talk about? What is the network of information in this organization? How does it flow? And who shares information? And what are the processes that lead to productivity or results in this organization? What do those processes look like? So are you required to send an email and then follow up a few days later? That is a role that communication is serving in that organization. That's what someone who comes from a cybernetic perspective or a lens or camp might think of when they try to answer the question of what is the role of communication in an organization. The fifth lens that we might use is the socio-psychological perspective. Now, if you can sort of break this word apart, what we're looking at is both the individual and the group, or in other words, the group's personality or identity or individuality. So we are looking at each person in the organization and how do they communicate? What are their personalities? What are their styles? And how is that impacting the organization? So we might see this pop up when we start thinking about the human resource arm of an organization that are looking at developing training or providing resources to people who are struggling with conflict in the organization or struggling to understand what their supervisors want from them. We see communication as very interactive from this perspective. We're looking at conversations that happen and we are trying to mediate them or resolve them or provide meaning in those interactions. But we also see communication as having an incredible influence on the organization from this perspective. All of these perspectives would say that communication has an influence, but this perspective would say not only does it have an influence, but it is about influencing specifically the organization. So someone from the socio-psychological perspective is going to see communication as interactive but interpersonal, and the impact of that communication then on organizations. From a socio-cultural perspective, someone who takes this lens or from this camp would try to answer the question of what is the role of communication in an organization by looking at communication as intersectional. In other words, you are a complex person and you have multiple identities, and where those identities overlap to make up you, we would call that an intersection, right? No one is just male or female or white. You are complex. You might be black and gay, or you might be black and a man, or you might be white and a Christian, or you might be female and autistic. Those things are intersecting. So a sociocultural perspective would be very interested in where your communication and your identity is coming from. And if we can understand the various pieces of someone's culture that make up who they are, we might better understand how they imbue their messages with meaning. We might better understand how to connect to people who are different than ourselves. The sociocultural perspective would look at communication in organizations and ask the question of what is the dominant capital D discourse? In other words, what is the conversation like on maybe a global scale or a national scale related to a given topic, and how is that impacting then the organization and how the organization talks about those things? It is both influenced by culture and it is creating a culture within the organization. We might look at things like the diversity of our group, the bilingual nature of an organization, or the globalization that impacts that organization from the sociocultural perspective. Sociocultural perspective is going to say we are all different in some way, shape, or form, and that it would be irresponsible to boil down our communication interpretation to one specific aspect of our organization or that person. The last type of perspective or lens that we might use in trying to answer the question of what is the role of communication in organization is a critical lens. A critical lens would answer that question by looking at systems of power and hierarchy. It would look at questioning the dominant narrative, and it would look at who gets to have a voice in answering the question, what is the role of communication in an organization? So some issues that someone might look at from this lens might have to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace, might have to deal with wage gap, might have to deal with affirmative action and perceptions of affirmative action, consequences of affirmative action. They might look at who stays in power, who gets a say in the organization, who gets to be themselves at work. All of these different lenses that we have looked at have something to contribute to our understanding of organizational communication. And we are going to take a look at this question of what is the role of communication in an organization through each of these lenses. You may find one that resonates with you more than the others, and that's all right. I encourage you to not write off any of these lenses because each of them have something to illuminate about organizational communication. This semester, we're going to try and answer that question of what is the role of communication in organization, or at least we're going to start answering that question because I'm still trying to answer that question. There are still areas in this discipline that are unanswered, questions that really need an answer. So we're just going to start by introducing some of these ideas. Those three big ideas that we're looking at. What is organizing? How does it happen? What is culture and what is its function? And what does power look like in an organization? We're going to use these 7 different ways trying to answer that question, ultimately to come up with a foundation that you can build on, either to take in very practically into an organization, but also theoretically. What's a good framework for understanding things that come out of your interactions in an organization? Organizational communication is complex, and there's lots of different things that we could focus on. So buckle up and get ready for this semester. The scope is huge, and we're going to try and limit it a little bit. But when something comes up that sparks your attention or your interest, let's explore it and pursue it, because maybe you're about to find an answer to a question that we haven't found an answer to.